I thought my home was my safe place, the one corner of the world where I could finally breathe easy. But one evening, as I pulled into my driveway, I noticed something strange, an unfamiliar sign staked right into my lawn. And then I realized my own property was being auctioned off by the very HOA that was supposed to protect the community. Imagine leaving for a short trip, expecting everything to be fine, only to return and find strangers walking through your yard as if they already owned it. Flyers circulating with your house listed for sale. And the person behind it all? A neighbor with just enough power, just enough arrogance to think they could erase you from your own land. What followed was not just paperwork and threats. It was a campaign designed to break me down, strip away my dignity, and force me out of the home I had built with my own hands. And the deeper I looked, the uglier it got. Secret meetings, hidden fines, and a betrayal that no homeowner should ever face. Life in our neighborhood had always felt like a quiet little bubble of comfort. Tree-lined streets, perfectly mowed lawns, the occasional sound of children laughing as they rode their bikes. My mornings were a routine of jogging past neighbors walking their dogs, waving to familiar faces, and coming home to the smell of fresh coffee drifting through the kitchen. On weekends, we'd grill in the backyard, listening to the faint hum of sprinklers and distant lawnmowers. Everything felt ordinary, safe, predictable. I had spent years building this life with my family. My spouse, always meticulous about the house and garden, took pride in every corner, every plant perfectly placed. Our kids laughed too loudly in the living room, fought over who got the bigger slice of pizza, and trailed their toys across the floors. Even our golden retriever had his usual spot in the sunlit patch of grass by the porch. This was home, our sanctuary. But beneath that calm, almost invisible layer, there was the HOA. The kind of organization most people only notice when a letter slides through the mailbox, demanding something you never knew was a rule. At first, they were distant and polite. Reminders about trash bins, gentle nudges about holiday decorations. I didn't think much of it. Rules, after all, were meant to maintain order. But sometimes, order has a sharp edge. It started with small things. A note left on the windshield for something trivial. A complaint about a mailbox that wasn't perfectly aligned. Then came the neighbors, the ones who seemed to watch every move, with smiles that never reached their eyes. They'd casually mention minor infractions in passing, hinting that the HOA would be noticing soon. I laughed it off at first, thinking they were just nosy. But as the days passed, the subtle undercurrent of tension grew heavier, almost tangible. I didn't realize that the seeds of conflict were already planted, that every small nudge and whispered warning was pushing us towards something far more invasive, something that would invade the quiet life we had worked so hard to build. And the day it truly began, the first official notice from the HOA, was just the beginning of a chain reaction that none of us saw coming. What no one told me, not even my closest friends, was that in this community, a momentary misstep, a neighbor's grudge, or the flip of a bureaucratic pen could spiral into a battle for control of not just property, but the very sense of security you take for granted. The first formal letter from the HOA had seemed almost trivial at the time. It was a small notice about the height of the grass in our backyard. Please ensure your lawn does not exceed 6 inches, it read in polite, officious language. I remember thinking, really? 6 inches? But I clipped a few blades, filed the note away, and assumed it was nothing more than bureaucracy. It didn't take long for the small irritations to multiply. The following week, a knock on the door revealed one of the neighborhood ambassadors, a volunteer HOA enforcer, staring at the fence that separated my property from the neighbors. "The fence color isn't approved," she said. I blinked, trying to mask my irritation. The fence had been gray for years, and there had never been a complaint. She left a form demanding immediate repainting, along with a veiled warning: failure to comply may result in fines. Then came the parking violations. Overnight, someone left a notice on my windshield about my car being improperly aligned in the driveway. The next morning, a different neighbor mentioned that the HOA had cited me for leaving a recycling bin out too early. It was relentless. Each new notice felt like a jab, each letter another weight pressing down on the walls of our home. At first, I tried to comply, thinking that appeasement might end the harassment. I painted the fence, adjusted the bins, and clipped the hedges to an almost obsessive perfection. But every time I checked the mailbox, there was something new waiting. An inspection notice, a complaint from a neighbor who seemed to be documenting our every move. And always, the subtle insinuation that failure would bring real consequences. Then came the fines. Small at first. $25 for a misplaced garden ornament, $50 for a swing set that was technically too close to the property line. But the amounts escalated faster than I could keep up. Every check I wrote felt like a surrender, and every late notice a confirmation that the system was rigged against me. What was worse, the fines weren't accompanied by explanations or recourse. One day, I found a letter that read simply, "Violation confirmed. Payment required immediately. No dialogue, no reasoning, just demands." The tension wasn't limited to paperwork. The neighbors began to watch more closely, their smiles sharpened with an edge I hadn't noticed before. They'd drop by casually, commenting on the fence, the driveway, or the mail. Their voices were always polite, but their eyes told a different story. A mixture of curiosity, judgment, and malice. And I began noticing cameras on porches I had never seen before, the quiet click of phones snapping photos of my property when I wasn't looking. It all escalated the evening we came home to find a flyer taped to our front door. The paper screamed in bold letters, "Property at risk of auction, immediate action required." My heart froze. I tore it down, hoping it was a mistake, but as I scanned the small print, my blood ran cold. It wasn't a mistake. Someone in the HOA had filed paperwork claiming our property was in violation of rules so obscure, so technical, that I had never even heard of them. And according to the HOA, unresolved violations were grounds for public auction. I spent the next days in a fog of disbelief, reaching out to contacts, searching through HOA bylaws, and speaking to neighbors. Some offered sympathy. Others smiled too widely, their eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of schadenfreude. Every phone call ended the same way, with polite promises that nothing could be done. My family felt the strain too. Conversations turned tense. Every creak of the front gate, every knock, made our pulse quicken. And yet, the escalation didn't stop there. One morning, I woke to see a group of HOA members inspecting our property unannounced. They took notes, measured distances, and even photographed items in the yard. I tried to intervene, to ask what was happening, but they brushed me off with that familiar phrase, "You will be notified of violations." Their confidence was unnerving. It was as if the house no longer belonged to us. It had been claimed by a system that thrived on intimidation. But perhaps the most demoralizing moment came when I discovered that neighbors had begun circulating rumors, quiet whispers about unpaid fines, about a household that was out of control. It spread like wildfire through the community, isolating us subtly but effectively. Friends we had trusted stopped calling. Mail carriers hesitated. Even casual greetings from neighbors were replaced by cold nods or sharp, calculating stares. I realized that the fight was no longer just about the rules, it was about power, control, and humiliation. I tried to hold on to a sense of rationality, to believe that reason could prevail. I combed through the HOA guidelines, documented every encounter, every letter, every fine. I prepared for the possibility of legal action, yet every step forward seemed to spark two more retaliations. Notices escalated. Fines multiplied. And through it all, the neighbor who had started it all, always polite, always smiling, watched from across the street as if the whole ordeal were entertainment. One night, exhausted and staring at the pile of notices on the kitchen table, I realized something horrifying. The HOA wasn't just enforcing rules, they were constructing a case, brick by brick, to claim our home, and we were trapped in the middle. And then it hit me. The next notice could be the one that tipped everything over. It could announce a public auction, a court hearing, or a fine so massive that our options would vanish in an instant. The morning the final notice arrived, I could feel the weight of weeks, no months, of tension pressing down on me. My hands shook as I tore open the envelope, half expecting it to contain yet another trivial fine, another minor complaint. But this one was different. The language was stark, unambiguous, almost celebratory in its cruelty. If unresolved, your property will be placed for auction within 30 days. Immediate compliance required. It was real, not a threat, not a bureaucratic mistake. They were serious. And in that moment, I realized that everything, every late-night note, every whispered rumor, every petty fine, had been building toward this crescendo. The HOA wasn't just asserting rules. They were asserting control, attempting to erase me from the place I had called home for years. Panic surged, but it was quickly replaced by determination. I couldn't let this happen, not to my family, not to the life we had painstakingly built. I scoured the bylaws, the county property codes, and every legal loophole I could find. I documented everything, letters, photos, dates, even the tiny details that most people would overlook. It became clear, if we were going to fight, we had to do it not just with words, but with meticulous evidence. The first step was confronting the neighbor at the center of this campaign. I walked across the street, heart pounding, past lawns lined with immaculate hedges that now felt like barriers to a battleground. She was tending her garden, perfectly poised, smiling as if unaware of the storm she had unleashed. I held up the stack of notices, my voice trembling but steady. This ends now. You can't just take our home over petty rules and personal grudges. Her response was eerily calm, almost rehearsed. We're just enforcing the community standards, she said, brushing soil from her gloves. If you'd complied sooner, none of this would have happened. But I could see it, the flicker of satisfaction in her eyes, the belief that she had already won. That's when I realized the confrontation alone wouldn't suffice. The HOA had made this personal, and so I escalated. I filed formal complaints, contacted legal advisors, and reached out to the few neighbors who had been quietly sympathetic. Every step was a battle, phone lines buzzing, emails ignored, deadlines looming like ominous clouds. I could feel the pressure building, like a vice tightening around our lives. The night before the scheduled auction, I barely slept. Every creak outside, every distant engine felt like a harbinger of disaster. The adrenaline was unbearable, but I knew one thing: we couldn't wait for mercy. We had to strike preemptively. At dawn, I arrived at the HOA office with every document, every piece of evidence we had collected over the months. I laid it all out. Photographs, letters, timestamps, even proof of their own procedural errors. The office was quiet, almost sterile, but tension hummed in the air. For hours, I explained each violation, each inconsistency, each rule that had been applied selectively or unfairly. At first, they tried to dismiss me, to redirect, to insist that everything was procedural, but as I methodically dismantled their claims, their faces began to change, shifts of doubt, micro-expressions of unease. Then came the unexpected twist. As I was speaking, my attorney arrived with a bombshell, a clause buried deep in the HOA bylaws that explicitly protected homeowners from punitive actions without proper notification and due process. This one clause, overlooked by the HOA for months, now turned the tables entirely. I watched as their confident smiles faltered, replaced by tension that mirrored my own weeks of fear. It was time for the public confrontation. I requested a meeting with the full HOA board and any witnesses who had filed complaints. In the community hall, rows of neighbors sat watching, curious, whispering, some openly taking sides. I presented the evidence, spoke clearly about the harassment, the fines, the selective enforcement of rules, and the psychological toll it had taken on my family. Every word was measured, but my emotions, anger, frustration, and unwavering resolve came through unmistakably. The board tried to interrupt, to talk over me, to discredit the facts, but I refused to be silenced. One by one, I revealed their errors, their inconsistencies, and the overreach that had fueled months of intimidation. Neighbors who had been on the sidelines shifted uneasily. Some leaned forward, eyes widening, as the reality of the HOA's actions finally became visible to all. And then came the turning point, the moment that transformed fear into triumph. A video surfaced, taken by a previously silent neighbor, showing the orchestrated harassment, the selective inspections, and even conversations where the HOA had openly discussed targeting our property. The footage was undeniable, and for the first time, the antagonist's composed exterior cracked. Her jaw tightened, her hands trembled slightly as she tried to respond, but the evidence was overwhelming. The room was electric with tension. Some neighbors murmured in disbelief, others nodded in agreement, but the energy had shifted. The board could no longer feign impartiality. Their authority, built over years, was being publicly challenged and dismantled in front of the very community they had sworn to serve. Finally, after what felt like hours condensed into minutes, the head of the HOA cleared his throat and acknowledged the findings. He spoke carefully, trying to salvage credibility, but it was too late. The votes were unanimous. Our fines were rescinded, our property reinstated, and the auction halted indefinitely. The antagonist had been publicly exposed for her abuse of power, her petty vendetta now fully visible. To everyone, the air outside our home felt different after the confrontation at the HOA meeting. It wasn't just relief, it was a sense of regained control, of having weathered a storm that seemed impossible to survive. Walking up the driveway, I noticed the sunlight catching the freshly painted fence, the perfectly trimmed hedges, and even the lawn that had been the first target of the HOA's scrutiny. For the first time in months, everything felt like ours again. Inside, the house was quiet. My family moved through the rooms almost cautiously, as though afraid to disturb the fragile sense of normalcy. But with each passing moment, laughter returned. The kids chased each other across the living room, my spouse hummed while preparing a late lunch, and even our golden retriever bounded toward the backyard with unrestrained joy. It was a normal day again, but with a newfound awareness of how easily it could have been lost. The aftermath of the HOA battle rippled through the neighborhood in ways I hadn't anticipated. Some neighbors who had quietly supported us came forward publicly, offering assistance, apologizing for their earlier silence, and joining us in small acts of solidarity, sharing stories of petty fines, overzealous inspections, and subtle intimidation they had endured themselves. The sense of community shifted. Where fear and suspicion had once thrived, accountability began to take root. Meanwhile, the antagonist, the neighbor who had orchestrated the harassment, faced consequences far beyond the meeting room. Her public exposure eroded the credibility she had relied on to assert authority. Complaints previously ignored suddenly gained weight, and the HOA board, chastened by the embarrassment, moved quickly to implement stricter oversight of enforcement actions. Rules were clarified, documentation required, and arbitrary fines became a thing of the past. Her influence with the king and the neighborhood diminished. Whispers of her vendetta became cautionary tales rather than hidden power plays. On a personal level, the experience left scars that were invisible yet palpable. Nights of anxiety and tension had taken a toll on our sleep, our patience, and our trust in the systems we once took for granted. But those same challenges forged resilience. I learned how to document meticulously, advocate assertively, and maintain composure under pressure. I discovered that even in situations designed to intimidate, careful preparation and calm determination could turn the tables. Financially, there were still lingering consequences. legal consultations, missed work, and the sheer emotional energy spent navigating the HOA bureaucracy left a mark. But the removal of fines and the halting of the auction prevented a disaster far greater than any temporary setbacks. What could have been catastrophic became a testament to persistence, strategy, and community support. Over the following weeks, I took steps to rebuild not just our home, but our neighborhood relationships. I organized informal gatherings, casual barbecues, and coffee meetups with neighbors who had been hesitant to speak up. The goal was simple: restore trust, rebuild communication, and remind everyone that a neighborhood is only as strong as the collective willingness to support each other rather than exploit loopholes or wield rules as weapons. Slowly, the atmosphere changed. Conversations became warmer, greetings more genuine, and the air of silent surveillance lifted. But the experience also left me wary. It was impossible to forget the power an organization like the HOA could wield if left unchecked. I began advocating for transparency, attending board meetings, and even volunteering to serve on committees where I could monitor policy enforcement. Knowledge, I realized, was the best safeguard against abuse. By being involved, I could ensure that no homeowner would face what we had endured without recourse. Emotionally, the journey had transformed our family. The sense of vulnerability gave way to empowerment. We had faced a system that seemed insurmountable and emerged with our dignity intact. Every conversation, every document, every small victory along the way reinforced a truth that had been easy to overlook. Standing up for oneself is rarely convenient, but it is essential when your home and sense of security are on the line. The lessons extended beyond the home. I became acutely aware of how small actions, rumors, selective enforcement, minor rules weaponized, can escalate into a campaign of control. It underscored the importance of community vigilance and the need for every individual to recognize the line between fair governance and oppressive authority. For anyone living under similar circumstances, the takeaway is clear: being proactive, informed, and as assertive is not just an option, it is a necessity. Months later, the neighborhood had settled into a more balanced rhythm. Meetings were structured, enforcement actions documented, and the community slowly repaired the trust that had been eroded. Our family's home became more than a safe space. It became a symbol of what can be achieved when perseverance meets strategy. We celebrated small victories: a friendly wave from a neighbor, a supportive note left anonymously, the return of carefree laughter in the yard, each one a reminder that peace, once disrupted, can be reclaimed. Yet the memory of the ordeal lingered. I couldn't erase the nights of dread, the anxiety of every envelope slipped through the mailbox, or the sting of whispered gossip and neighborly judgment. Those experiences, though painful, became lessons. They reminded me that power is often hidden in subtlety, that intimidation can be systemic, and that the courage to confront it requires more than anger. It demands meticulous preparation, calm resolve, and unwavering focus. Ultimately, the story of our struggle with the HOA became more than a personal victory. It became a cautionary tale. Friends and neighbors began reaching out, asking for guidance, sharing their own experiences, and seeking advice on how to protect themselves. By turning our ordeal into a resource, we transformed fear into empowerment, isolation into connection, and vulnerability into action. And the most powerful lesson I carry with me today is simple: your home, your rights, and your dignity are worth defending. Systems designed to protect can be misused, neighbors can act with self-interest, and rules can be twisted. But courage, preparation, and a clear understanding of your rights are formidable shields. Every homeowner should know this. Vigilance matters, documentation matters, and community awareness can change outcomes that seem impossible. As I look back now, sitting on our porch with sunlight spilling over the lawn and the faint laughter of my children echoing through the air, I can finally breathe. Our home is safe, our family is whole, and the neighborhood, once tense and suspicious, has begun to heal. Yet I know that vigilance is ongoing. Power can be abused at any moment, and peace is never guaranteed. So here's the takeaway. Standing up for what's right is never easy. The cost is real, the stress is immense, and the path is fraught with obstacles. But reclaiming control over your life, protecting your home, and preserving your dignity is priceless. The struggle may leave scars, but it also leaves resilience, wisdom, and the knowledge that you can endure and even triumph when the odds seem insurmountable. And as we wave to neighbors passing by, seeing familiar faces, sharing knowing smiles, I can't help but wonder, how many others out there are silently fighting their own battles? And what will it take for them to reclaim the peace and security they deserve? Because in the end, every home is a battleground for dignity, and every act of courage, no matter how small, can change the course of a life.